My guest today, Jeff Sebo. Jeff, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to see you too.
Yeah. Listen, Jeff, I get all the guests to tell us a bit about who they are and what their background is. Would you mind walking us through that?
Yeah, sure. My name is Jeff, as you said, and my background is in philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy, though I now do more interdisciplinary work. I teach in the environmental studies department at
Hmm.
New York University and then do work with related departments like philosophy and law. And I, broadly speaking, have a background in moral and legal and political philosophy and philosophy of mind. And I really focus on our relationships with and responsibilities toward the non-human world. So what, if anything, do we owe different non-human animals? What, if anything, might we owe AI systems in the future? Those are the main questions I focus on.
Oh, interesting. Do you have influences, philosophers that you fancy, that you studied with, that sort of thing?
Oh, I have all kinds of influences of various kinds. I mean, in terms of my own personal journey through philosophy, I can say that my professors at Texas Christian University, a liberal arts university in Fort Worth, Texas, were hugely influential for me. So that includes Blake Hester, Greg Francois, Richard Galvin. And then in graduate school too, my professors I studied with, David Velleman was my dissertation chair.
Hmm.
And then I also worked with Derek Parfit and Sharon Street, John Richardson, more recently Dale Jameson. But philosophically, in terms of the ideas, well, the advisors are pretty influential there too. But the existentialists were hugely formative for me. So Camus, Sartre, Beauvoir, and also the great ethicists ranging from Aristotle and his conversations about virtues, and then Kant and his conversations about duty and rationality, and then of course Bentham and Mill and their conversations
Wow.
about consequences. So from lots of different parts, and that might come through in the conversation because my own orientation is somewhat pluralistic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're a man after my own heart with Bentham for sure. Our son,
Yeah,
our first son's named Jeremy for
really.
yeah that particular reason. And
After Jeremy Bentham in particular.
yeah, I actually have a picture of my son next to Bentham at University College London,
Wow, that is awesome.
and he's wearing a Toronto Raptors shirt. So we got a little Canadian pride happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only downside is that pretty much guarantees he grows up and rebels and becomes a Kantian. But I guess you take that risk as a parent.
Inside philosopher humor that none of our audience will care for, but you and I get a good chuckle out of. And
Yeah.
Camus, my all-time favorite existentialist for sure.
Mm,
Not sure if you're aware of this or not. Viggo Mortensen is a huge fan of Camus.
really? I
Reads
had no idea. Ah, fascinating.
reads him in French. Like you can go online and you can find Vigo
Mm,
reading the original. Yeah, like
that's cool. That's
yeah.
really cool.
We're gonna try to have him on the podcast so we can talk a little bit more about that. But you're here now, sir, and where are you? Are you at NYU? Whereabouts?
Yeah, currently in my apartment near NYU, hanging out with my dog.
Oh, wow.
Always a nice place to do a
Mine's scratching
podcast
at the
interview.
door. So he was just here, but we ran out of treats, so he's moved on to better things. All
Yeah,
right.
fair.
Anyhow, good stuff. Good stuff. Um, listen, since the podcast is this season is all about AI,
Mm,
you're very much interested in aspects of ethics and consciousness. So I'd like to talk about both of those things as they relate to artificial
hmm.
intelligence. We can start with either one. Consciousness, I guess we can start with that.
Sure.
Um, it's always been my favorite topic of AI. It'd be interesting to see how we have similarities and differences about
Hmm.
the notion of consciousness. Your area, um, what aspects of AI and consciousness are you interested in? Do they tie directly into ethics, or is it some other aspect as well? Do you want to tell us a bit about?
Yeah, It comes primarily from ethics. Obviously, consciousness might be linked with other kinds of capabilities that might raise AI safety and alignment concerns. In other words, that might make AI systems more dangerous and might give us kind of self-interested reasons to worry about
Right.
their becoming conscious. And I do care a lot about that, but in terms of my own contribution to the conversation, my focus is a little bit more on what consciousness might mean for the moral significance of the AI systems themselves. So
Hmm.
in other words, if AI systems can be conscious in the sense of having subjective awareness, it feels like something to be them, then could they also be sentient, have positive or negative states like pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, satisfaction, frustration? And if they can be conscious, subjectively aware, and they could have those kinds of positive or negative subjective states, then they might have the capacity for welfare. They might be capable of being benefited or harmed by what we do to them. And at that point, we might have moral responsibilities towards them. So we might
Mm.
have moral responsibilities not only to treat them in a way that has good impacts for humans and other animals, but also to treat them in a way that has good impacts for the AI systems themselves. So I am very interested in asking whether and when they might take on that form of kind of intrinsic moral significance and be the subjects of responsibilities that we have to them. And then how can we tell and what should we do to prepare?
Okay. This is good. This is interesting. I often talk with colleagues about the difference between, say, consciousness and sentience,
Mm-hmm,
consciousness and agency. These are
mm-hmm,
terms that
mm-hmm.
occur all the time in discussions. Do you make any delineations or distinctions between sentience from consciousness? Are these two intimately tied together? Can you have one without the other?
They are tied together, and I think people sometimes use these words
They
interchangeably.
do.
And so when you see the words out in the wild, you should not have any assumptions about what the person means by it. But I can tell you what I mean by it. And this is similar to what some other people, like I think Jonathan Birch and others mean by it, which is that consciousness is, as I said, subjective awareness. So you are conscious when it feels like something to be you. And then you are sentient when you can also have conscious states with a positive or negative subjective valence. In other words, conscious states that feel good or bad to you from your own perspective. And
Oh,
so a conscious state could be positive, negative, or neutral. It could be, purely seeing a color or purely hearing a sound, but not feeling good or bad, right? But it becomes sentience once it starts to take on those positive or negative colors, once it starts to feel good and you want more of it, or once it starts to feel
interesting.
bad and you want less of it.
Interesting.
So that is how I understand the distinction between consciousness and sentience. And that matters because some people, not everybody, but some people think that you need that positive and negative valence, that liking and disliking, in order for it to matter to you what happens to you, in order for our interactions with you to have significance for you and for you to have a stake in the outcome. So that is the distinction between consciousness and sentience. We
Mhm.
can then talk about those things in agency, but that seems like a good place to start.
Okay, interesting. Some people do it almost in a reverse fashion. They say a thing
Mm-hmm.
can be sentient, it can be aware of its surroundings. So I've written
Mm-hmm.
that amoeba are sentient. They know what is consumable and what isn't consumable. So they have a
Mm-hmm.
delineation or a
Mm-hmm.
distinction between food. But to me,
Right.
consciousness is a higher order where it kind of refers to what we call a meta awareness or an ability to
Mm-hmm.
step back from our situation and see ourselves in a situation as it relates to others, an ecosystem, those types of things. So it's interesting
Yeah.
that those two are there. Now,
Yeah.
a colleague of mine, Corin at Convergence Analysis, he's very much interested in agency, the topic of agency. And I've
Mm-hmm.
always had issues with this concept because to me, there's agency. When something is an agent, it acts towards a particular type of goal, whether it's aware of that or not. But to me, the
Mm-hmm.
important thing is when something is a moral agent, it
Mm-hmm.
must know then of a value system. It must know that certain actions are good or bad, however, which way it defines it or has a concept of what
Hmm.
good or bad, right or wrong, fair, unfair, just, unjust, any of those value laden terms, right? Those then come into play and makes it a moral agent. Can AI simply be an agent? Can it be agentic and
Hmm.
completely lack any moral concept whatsoever?
Yeah.
And if it becomes consciously aware that it exists and that it can affect change and that it can do things, is that then when it becomes a moral agent, then when it now knows it has a value system?
Yeah, that generally is my view. Now,
Mhm.
I will say that I think matters are a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
So the standard distinction is between moral agents and moral patients, and roughly the way of putting this distinction, as you know, but for your listeners, roughly the way of putting this distinction is you count as a moral agent when you can have duties to others,
Correct.
and you count as a moral patient when others can have duties to you.
Yes.
And that raises the question, what are the conditions or the requirements for being a moral agent or a moral patient? The standard answer on the moral agent side, as you say, is you need advanced language and reason to
Mm.
be a moral agent because you need to understand and be able to think critically about moral laws and principles themselves, right? Like if a hurricane kills somebody, we can call that bad. But if a moral agent kills somebody, despite knowing better, despite knowing that this is wrong, we can call that wrong, not just bad, but wrong. So I think that is roughly right. Though the caveat is that there might be some language, some sort of features that we generally attribute to moral agents
Mm.
that we might be able to attribute to non-moral agents too. So for example, virtues and vices, character traits that are good or bad to have, it
Mhm.
might make sense to attribute those to non-moral agents,
Right.
or certain types of accountability or liability for behavior that fall
Mhm.
short of like deserving blame.
Mhm.
That might be so there might be that kind of scale of moral agency and those sorts of attributions.
Right. So we have the moral agent acting and we have the so-called moral patient receiving.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know who came up with the concept of moral patienthood? Do we know where that first?
Somebody does, but I forget
Yeah.
off the top of my head
Not
who
a
it is.
huge
We
fan
can.
of the term, never liked it. Always, like, why not
Yeah, yeah,
recipient? Why not moral recipient, right? Receivership rather than patient.
yeah.
But anyhow, we're here
Fair,
now.
fair. Yeah,
You're right.
fair.
The terms are being doled out. I took
Hmm.
on Robin Dunbar early on to say theory of mind. Really, you came up with the concept
Hmm.
of theory. We have philosophy of mind, Robin. Now you're bringing in theory of mind, and he apologized, but he said, "Yeah, it's out there.
Yeah,
It
a
exists."
lot of the terms in this domain are misleading. So
Mm,
theory of mind is basically what you have when you can be aware of the mental states of somebody else.
correct.
But the term theory of mind makes it sound way more theoretical than it needs
It
to be.
does.
Like my dog has theory of mind in the sense that he can anticipate my reactions to things intuitively, but
That's
not
right.
in the sense that he has a theory of what my mind is like, right?
Correct.
And similarly with mind reading is another
Mm,
term that people use for this. Mind
yeah.
reading is just a fancy way of saying you can perceive the mental states of others through their behavior, but it conjures this kind of sense of having like a sixth sense where you can like directly see the mental states of others. So
Yes.
a lot of this language is misleading.
Yeah, yeah, interesting, interesting. And we're throwing around a lot of concepts. Um, one of which the notion of theory of mind, to know that another being thinks like you, functions like you, looks like you, so it probably acts like you can anticipate its motives, you can try to better understand why it does the things it does. Will this be something that AI will develop? Some believe at some levels, some of the large language models like ChatGPT and Claude and others are starting to develop a quote theory of mind that they know what's going on and as we think. Do you think we're anywhere near that with AI in its current form?
Yeah, good question. So as a sort of meta note, one thing that I would say is that a lesson learned from the study of animal minds, which I think is good to keep in mind for the study of AI minds, is that very few of these questions admit of binary yes or no,
Hmm.
all or nothing answers. Really, all of these capacities have different kinds and degrees, and we have this as a commonality in some respects, but then are different in other respects. So there is some sense of theory of mind in which my dog and I both have a theory of
Yeah,
mind,
of course.
those anticipations and perceptions, but then another sense of theory of mind, like a more fine-grained one, a more
Hmm.
detailed one,
Hmm.
in which I alone have a theory of mind. And that might be something like being able to construct an actual theory about the whole psychological profile of a being, and sort of reflect on that and make predictions and test those predictions and so on, right? Now with AI systems, I think something similar is going to end up being true, where if we ask the question in a kind of general or coarse grained way, the answer is plausibly already yes. Like I can already have conversations with ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini where we go back and forth in a way that is tracking what each other is claiming to be thinking or feeling. But
Hmm.
of course, the way that the chatbot is participating in that conversation is very different from the way that a human would participate in that conversation, right? By making predictions based on pattern recognition,
Hmm.
as opposed to by conjuring and maintaining a kind of psychological profile and so
Hmm.
on. Now, in the future, we might see AI systems develop more fine grained versions of these capacities where it does start to resemble the human version. It may or may not like feel like anything for the AI system to be going through this process. That raises the question of consciousness. But functionally, I do think over time, and possibly sooner than we realize, functionally, I do think that there will be more convergence between the ways in which we model other minds and the ways in which AI systems model other minds.
Okay. Now the critics out there, the Gary Marcus, the Steve Pinkers, the Noam Chomskys, they tend to think LLMs are just kind of glorified calculators. You know what I mean? That like they're just
Mm-hmm.
smarter versions of previous forms of AI. Do you
Mm-hmm.
feel there is something more at work going on? Do they actually have an understanding of what's going on in our world in similar ways that humans do?
Yeah, understanding is another one of those loaded terms, right? And it breaks down into all sorts of kinds and degrees. So again, in one sense, yes, in one sense, no. I think there are at least a couple of general important points to make here. One is that we should not be overconfident about our understanding of even current generation large language models. It can be tempting to discount their capabilities because we know that we created them, and we know that we created them with a particular simple purpose in mind, right? Like
Yeah.
their simple purpose is to predict which word makes sense next
Right.
based on the words that came before, based on their training data, and so on and so forth. And that is very straightforward and nothing like what we take ourselves to be aiming to do when we generate language. But but LLMs in the course of development and deployment and scaling, they might develop fairly complex ways of achieving that simple goal without our knowing that, without our predicting it, without our intending it. So if you compare, this is only a rough analogy, but of course, evolution programmed us to pursue a simple goal too, which is survival and reproduction. But we evolved all kinds of complex capabilities in the course of optimizing ourselves for achieving that simple goal, including consciousness and sentience and agency. And so we should allow for the possibility that even if we program LLMs to pursue a simple goal, they may well develop complex capabilities in the course of optimizing themselves for achieving that simple goal. And especially when we find ourselves surprised by
Mhm.
how well they perform a task, or by the fact that they can perform a task that we never intended for them to perform, that should give us some evidence that something might be happening beyond what we were
Right.
intending.
Right. Right.
That was the first point. I'll pause there, but then there is one other point to add.
Yeah. And then there's the issue of determination. Um, so there's a term that's floated about in AI circles called stochastic parroting, where
Mm-hmm.
it looks like the thing that we're talking to cares about us or knows about us, or that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing,
Mm-hmm.
when in fact it has
Mm-hmm.
really no idea. If AI
Mm-hmm.
should become conscious, there are two main issues. Will it be anything like human consciousness?
Right.
Because it doesn't have to be, right? Airplanes don't flap their wings when they take off, right? They don't have to mimic
Right.
birds to fly 1,000 times better than birds. So they do it differently.
Right.
Might AI be differently? And then secondly, as in one of my favorite science fiction movies of all time, in Blade Runner, we have the main character, Deckard, using a technique called the Voight-Kampff test to try to determine if the individual he's speaking with is a human or an android. Is there going to be a Voight-Kampff test for AI consciousness so that we'll know for sure that it's not
Yeah.
mimicking like a parrot, that it
Right.
actually is conscious?
Yeah, so those are both really important questions and are great to distinguish. I'm glad that you did. One is about, are they conscious in the first place? And this is the second question that you asked. Are they conscious? How can we tell? And then the other is, okay, if they are conscious, what kind of consciousness do they have, and what kinds of interests and needs and vulnerabilities do they have? Because again, as with other animals, they might be like ours in some ways, but then
Yes.
unlike ours in some ways, and we need to map that. So with respect to the first question, I think sadly that the answer is no, we will not be able to know for sure, at least not anytime soon, at least not without some paradigm shattering breakthrough in the science of consciousness and the philosophy of consciousness. And so we can again look to the study of animal minds for a preview of what the study of digital minds might evolve.
Mm.
When we ask whether particular non-human animals are conscious, the question is not yes or no, all or nothing. The question is a matter of probabilities, of degrees of confidence based on the available evidence. And so
So it's more
we
spectral
know
than binary.
exactly, we know what kinds of behavioral, anatomical, and evolutionary features coincide with our conscious states.
Mm.
And so we can identify kind of observable markers of those features. And then we could look for relevantly similar markers in other animals. And then based on how many of them we find, we can come up with at least rough degrees of confidence that those animals are conscious. And this is not perfect. We shouldn't be overly precise or overly confident that our estimates are exactly right. But we can say something like all mammals and birds have a very high probability of being conscious given the evidence available to us. And then all vertebrates and many invertebrates, including cephalopod mollusks, decapod crustaceans, and insects, have at least a realistic possibility of being conscious given the evidence available to us, enough for us to consider it welfare risk for these animals.
Mm.
Now, with AI systems, for the reason you noted, things are a little bit different because we are not able to rely on behavioral evidence for their being conscious as much as we can with other animals. With other animals, we have enough anatomical and evolutionary continuity that when they behave like we do when we're in pain, we can take that as decent evidence that they're in pain too. But with AI systems, given the way that we programmed them to act in ways that are very different from what might actually be happening under the hood, those behaviors mean very little, if anything at all. So we have to look underneath the behaviors at their architectural features, and we can look at their architectures to see if they have the kinds of systems that would allow for the kinds of capacities that coincide with consciousness at a fairly high level of generality. So that's the best we can do right now, but it's better than nothing.
And Patrick Butlin and Robert Long call these indicator properties. Are there any?
That's right.
Are you familiar with this term, or what types of indicator properties under the hood might lead us to conclude that an AI might be conscious?
Yeah, what you do is so this is something that Patrick and Rob, as you gestured at, they produced a big report on this topic last year, and they and I are now working with an overlapping team to produce an updated report that we hope to release soon that goes into a little bit more detail. And basically, what we say there is the same as what they said in the other one, which is that behavioral indicators mean very little. You should instead look at architectural indicators. And the way that you do that is by surveying leading neuroscientific theories of consciousness for the types of functional capacities that they take to be central to consciousness. And there are different theories, and each one emphasizes different functional capacities. But examples would be a certain kind of embodied perception, like having a physical body and then having capacities for
Mm.
perception, and
Mhm.
then maybe a capacity for an attention schema, being able to direct your attention towards some perceptions instead of others.
Mm.
Then maybe a global workspace, having these different modules that focus on different tasks, but then a kind of central place that collects all of that information and then projects the real important stuff back out to the modules. And then more stuff I could say, but those are some examples. And so what you can do then is go ask questions like, okay, does this AI system have a body? Does this AI system have the capacity for sensory perception, like taking in stimuli from the environment?
Right.
Does the AI system then have the capacity to attend to some perceptions instead of others? Does it have the capacity to then broadcast the important information to all of the modules and kind of integrate their activity?
Mhm.
And then, there can be 10 other indicators, and you ask for about those too. And none of these is dispositive. None of these is proof,
Right.
right? But each one can kind of tick up the probability. And once a certain number of them are present and interconnected in the right kind of way, then as with other animals, that probability might shift from like negligible to non-negligible.
Yeah.
And at that point, there start to be welfare risks given
Yeah.
the information available to us.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember Butlin and Long and the other folks in that major paper. Towards the end, they do state, and maybe perhaps we will have to borrow on behavioral patterns if we can't
Mm-hmm.
directly look under the hood or in conjunction with ticking off these indicator properties, then we look at their behavior and say, man, analogously, it's kind of just like us, right? And so,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay, we'll say this thing is now conscious.
Yeah, we should be wary of behavior
Yes.
given what you were discussing, but we shouldn't completely write it off as a potential source of evidence. We just need to
Right.
approach it very carefully and cautiously and set up the study of behavioral evidence in a way that accounts for the possibility of being misled
Yes.
by their behaviors. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in the language of the folks in AI, we
Mm-hmm.
have ANI, right? Very narrow form of artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, your Roomba, Siri, Alexa. It's very
Yeah.
narrow. These things do very interesting and sometimes very powerful things, but they will
Mm-hmm.
never, so to speak, do anything counter to what their algorithms tell them to do. And then there's AGI, which the race seems to be on now. That's why I called my book Building a God. I see this as being a kind of a race to try to build a super intelligent machine God type of thing. And then there's ASI, which is artificial
Mm-hmm.
super intelligence. Now, I found there are kind of like schools of thought in AI where you have the scalars, we'll call them. And that
Mm-hmm.
means if you just give AI more compute and more data, and you just keep giving it more and more and more and make it bigger and bigger and have it recursively learn and learn and learn, it will
Mm-hmm.
eventually come into being. It'll develop into artificial general intelligence, right? So it'll be that next step. And that might be a short, takeoff time. It might be a little bit longer. Some people believe it'll be a foom, all at once, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So those are the scalars. But then there's another group who believe in embodiment, that this thing's never going to get to AGI unless you take all of its intelligence and let it move around in kind of four-dimensional space, right? It has to be
Yeah. Yeah.
embodied in order to be human-like. And then the third school are what I call the distributive group. Don't make one unit, make 1,000 units and have them move around in physical space. And everything that one learns, immediately the 999 learn. So it's this constant, almost like the Borg, in Star Trek. So there are these three camps now that are kind of emerging. Do you think any one of them is closer to getting us towards AGI?
Well, I think that I am not a great judge of what is going to get us to AGI or especially ASI.
Hmm.
I also, though, think none of us is a great judge of what will get us to
That's right.
AGI
Yeah.
or ASI. And importantly, we should be mindful of the distinction between human intelligence in particular and general intelligence in general, because there could be other paths towards powerful intelligence, and there can be other kinds of powerful intelligence other than our path and other than our intelligence. So just make that point and set it aside. For me, as I said at the start of this conversation, this all ultimately, my interest in the topic all ultimately comes from ethical concerns.
Right.
And so, I find making predictions interesting in its own right, but for me, I find it important mainly as a guide to ethical decision making.
Right.
And and for those purposes, I don't think that we need to say exactly what will happen. I think it is enough that we are at a pretty uncertain point where this is a really complicated, fast moving
Mm.
situation where a lot of experts disagree about where the technology is going to go from here. And there are plausible arguments for hitting diminishing returns with the existing paradigm. There are plausible arguments for us really speeding up with the existing paradigm. And then, of course, there are all kinds of incentives to explore that as well as new paradigms. And so for me, what matters is not what is likely to happen or what will happen. What matters is that there is at least a realistic possibility of keeping going at the current pace or speeding up. And if we were to keep going at the current pace or speed up, then I do think we would hit in the near future AI systems with enough advanced and integrated capacities for perception and attention and learning and memory and so on and so forth, that it would raise significant moral questions, both
Right.
for what happens to us and animals and what happens to them. That to me is the key issue.
Sure. Sure. Just for my own interest, would
Mm-hmm.
AGI be conscious? Would that be necessary sufficient conditions for AGI to come about, or can it come about without being conscious whatsoever?
In the absence of a secure theory of consciousness, I don't think we can say for sure.
Right.
So all of my answers, I know it can feel a little bit evasive, but all of my answers are rooted in the reality of disagreement and uncertainty about incredibly complicated
Yeah.
phenomena, and consciousness is chief among them, right? We do not yet have a secure theory of consciousness. And so there just still is debate about, for example, whether you need a certain amount of complexity of certain sorts, whether you need a certain amount of centralization of certain sorts, whether you need a carbon based substrate, carbon based cells or neurons. There just still is disagreement and uncertainty about all of those things. And so, what we have to do, once again, is kind of assign probabilities to different theories of consciousness being true. And so, what I think about consciousness is the same as what I think about the trajectory of AI. Even if I felt confident AI would slow down, if there is a realistic chance that it will speed up, we got to take that into account. And
Mhm.
likewise, even if carbon based cells are required for consciousness, that general intelligence is not enough, carbon based cells are required.
Mm.
If there is a realistic chance general intelligence is enough for consciousness, you got to take that into account. And in both cases, I think there is a decent chance AI will speed up, and a decent chance that some very complex and centralized set of capabilities that can be realized in silicon are sufficient for consciousness. And that is what keeps me up at night.
Right. Right. Interesting. Now, you've maintained that humans have a duty to extend moral considerations to some AI systems by 2030. So
Yeah.
why is that? What do you base that on? Could anything change your mind in either direction?
Yeah, good question. So I base that on the kind of argument that I just outlined. I think that we have a responsibility to consider non-negligible risks when making decisions, and a risk can be non-negligible. It can merit consideration, even if the probability of harm is quite low, right? Like, so why is driving drunk wrong? Not because it
Right.
definitely will kill someone, not because it will probably kill someone. It might have only a 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 chance of killing someone. But if it has a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of killing someone unnecessarily,
Mhm.
then that should at least be a factor in your decision. And it might even be a decisive factor, right? Maybe reason enough to find another way home. And then similarly, I think we should ask questions about moral considerability in the same kind of way. So, why is torturing an insect for fun wrong? Not necessarily because the insect definitely is conscious, not necessarily because the insect probably is conscious. The insect might have only a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of being conscious. But if the insect is a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of being conscious, then that should at least be a factor in my decision about whether to torture the insect for fun. And again, maybe it should be a decisive factor along with other considerations like
Mhm.
I should cultivate virtues and not be in the habit of torturing anything, right? And so that I think is what the standard should be. Not
Right.
not do they matter? Are they conscious? Not even do they probably matter? Are they probably conscious? I think the standard for whether we extend them consideration should just be: is there a realistic, non-negligible chance that they have morally significant capabilities like consciousness?
Right.
And then once you make that clear, then the question just becomes, do AI systems in the near future meet that standard? And I think the answer is yes, given the uncertain trajectory of AI development, given the lack of a secure theory of consciousness. We really, in the spirit of caution and humility, ought to allow for at least a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance that some AI system in the next 5 years is going to have some set of complex capabilities such that the probability of consciousness ticks up into, say, 1 in 100 or even 1 in 10, in my view. And
Mm.
and at that point, we ought to at least give them a little bit of consideration in the spirit of mitigating risks that our actions might be causing.
Right. Right. And then what kind of ethical or legal or political status should these types of systems have? And then what criteria do you think we should use to determine those?
Yeah, well, that raises a lot of further questions,
Mhm.
and I think, substantively, I think that they are going to need to have a pretty robust set of welfare protections and legal and political
Right.
rights, but we should not make any assumptions based on our welfare protections and our legal and political rights about what theirs should be like, nor should we make any assumptions based on animals welfare protections, what AI welfare protections should be like, because these are all works in progress and all of these populations are going to be really different. So procedurally, I would suggest that we just start with low hanging fruit, that
Okay.
we start by extending them any consideration at all, acknowledging that this is even a credible and legitimate issue, and that we start setting up some way of assessing them for potential moral significance and for potential benefits and harms, with at least the kinds of welfare assessment committees that we have for non-human animals in research context, right? We have like IACUCs, animal care and use committees, and those have scientists and non-scientists and community members, and they sit around, look at assessments that experts provide, and then they make judgments about whether the benefits outweigh the risk. I think we can start with something like that. And then along the way, we can then ask the further, harder questions about where to go from there.
Yeah.
Should we consider rights? What kinds of rights should we consider? That
Right.
should be an ongoing, long term process.
Okay. Here's an interesting question to consider. If consciousness could emerge in AI, and if in so doing, it can suffer more greatly because of it's aware of being turned off, or it's aware of harm or whatever. Should we
Mm-hmm.
just stop that? Should we just slow things down right now and just not make AI, right? Do we owe it
Yeah,
a
yeah.
duty not to bring it into existence in the first place? So,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, that raises questions that philosophers describe as creation ethics and population ethics questions, right?
Yeah.
And I think, we can say that if we know somebody is going to have a bad life, a life such that non-existence would be better, then we have a duty not to bring them into existence. If, however, we are uncertain about whether someone would have a good or a bad life, then things are more complicated. You have to weigh the benefit of having a life worth living
Mm-hmm.
against the harm of having a life not worth living. You also, of course, have to ask, is there anything that we could do to create them and improve the odds of their having a life worth living, right? So
Right.
for example, in the case of other animals, a lot of farmed animals have lives that are not worth living, but that is because we create them and then torture them. So we do that to them. But whereas if we were to create them and then not torture them, if we were to create them and then empower them to flourish as the kinds of beings they are, then we would be having a very different conversation.
Mm.
And so I do think that we should slow down, certainly, if we can solve the global coordination problem in arms race. I think we should slow down, both for AI safety reasons, to make sure that we develop AI in a way that can be safe for us,
Right.
and for AI welfare reasons, to make sure we can develop AI in a way that can be safe for the AI systems themselves. But then if we slow down and we do that work responsibly, I would want to allow for the possibility that we could bring into existence new forms of consciousness that could experience new forms of happiness in ways that would be good for them. And I wouldn't want to foreclose that possibility just because we're presently behaving in a reckless way.
Mm-hmm. So what would a morally good world with AI consciousness look like, kind of in concrete, terms? What would that look like if you could imagine such a world?
Yeah, it is hard to
Yeah.
imagine right now, and I don't want to be limited by our current imaginations, but to speak in kind of vague, hand wavy terms, what I imagine is a world where humans and animals and AI systems are living together in relative harmony. I say relative harmony because we might never be able to achieve a world that will be perfect for everyone, but we might at least be able to pursue co-beneficial ways of living to the extent that they exist, and then to prioritize thoughtfully to the extent that conflict is inevitable and priority setting
Mm-hmm.
is inevitable, is necessary. And so, to start with humans and other animals, things like ending factory farming and scaling down animal use industries, and scaling up plant-based alternatives. And then when we build new infrastructures to be more resilient and sustainable in the face of human caused climate change, thinking about how humans and other animals will be affected. And then that makes us think, oh, we should put bird friendly glass on the windows. And oh, we should put overpasses and underpasses on the corridors.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the kinds of co-beneficial realizations that we have and policies that we can create once we just start thinking about all the different stakeholders at the same time. And so I don't have as clear a sense of what that looks like concretely for organic and digital beings yet. You have to think about not only like humans and animals and robots coexisting in the real world, but then also physical beings and then stimulated beings coexisting at different levels of reality. And then our imaginations run wild in all kinds of different directions. But if we start with a commitment to considering everyone who has a realistic chance of mattering,
Mm-hmm.
and with an aspiration to just start by looking for co-beneficial solutions whenever new questions or problems arise, then I think that makes us more likely to find our way to those forms of coexistence along the way.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Now, I've had Peter Singer on the podcast. He shares many of the same sentiments you do. He's a kind of a dyed-in-the-wool utilitarian, the greatest
Mm-hmm.
good for the greatest number.
Mm-hmm.
What school of ethics do you draw upon? Are you a principalist? You kind of do a buffet style? I like a little deontology with my virtue, with my utility.
Yeah,
How do you
yeah,
see
yeah.
things? Yeah.
Yeah, so I am a utilitarian, and so that does mean I agree with Peter. I agree with Jeremy Bentham, who your kid is named after.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with them that our moral responsibility is to do the most good possible, to maximize happiness, minimize suffering for all sentient beings from now until the end of time. But in practice, I am a little bit more of a pluralist, as I mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
because I think that in practice, for biased and ignorant and imperfect beings like us, maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering requires creating and maintaining systems of rights, because those can serve as checks against biased and self-serving applications of harm benefit analysis, and cultivating virtuous character traits, because we can't always trust ourselves to think about principles. Sometimes we just do what feels natural in the
Yes.
moment, and our character traits have to guide us. And then, creating good systems and structures so that our incentives can be organized in ways that pull good behaviors out of us. And so I think, yeah, in theory, we should promote the best consequences, maximize happiness. But in practice, we should do something more like kind of guide ourselves in that direction while respecting rights, while expressing virtuous character traits, while creating and maintaining caring relationships. And it should be a little bit more of a balancing act.
Mm-hmm. And to close off with, you were in Texas for a bit. Your undergrad.
Mm-hmm.
They like beef and in Texas, and
Yeah, it's true.
and if it's difficult to have somebody empathize for an actual living thing like an animal, which can clearly analogously demonstrate pain because of a nervous system, how do you think people are going to react to silicon-based artificial digital life forms? Are they going to just say, pull the freaking plug? I don't care about this thing. I got to go get a steak, right? Like, are they even going to care about digital minds should they come into being?
Yeah, I think we have evidence that points in both directions. So on the one hand, as you said, we do see ourselves in animals a little bit more. We are made out of the same stuff. We co-evolved on the same tree of life, and that gives us some sense of maybe substratism, a preference for beings of our own substrate. But then on the other hand, we also have all of this like status quo bias and sunk cost reasoning associated with our now long-standing exploitation and extermination of other animals. We built up an entire global food system around our exploitation and extermination of other animals. And so now we have all kinds of incentives to make judgments that allow for that to continue, whereas we have a little bit more of a clean slate with AI systems. We have a little opportunity before we lock in the exploitation of them. We have a little bit more of an opportunity to ask whether we should go down that path. We also are just going to have a much wider range of AI systems and behaviors. So some are going to be utterly alien, but others are going to be humanoid and will seem to think and talk and behave like us. And so in those cases, we might be at much greater risk of anthropomorphism, of attributing human characteristics to them. Whereas with like radically different kinds, we might be at much more risk of anthropodenial. So in some cases, yeah, I think the odds of treating AI systems well will be way lower. In other cases, I think, at least for a period of time, a little window of opportunity, the odds may be higher. But the final thing to say here is I don't think we should wait to reach a certain place in our treatment of humans and other animals before we start asking these questions with AI systems. I don't want to make the mistake of saying, well, we shouldn't care about animals until we have fully achieved justice for humans. I don't want to say the same thing. Well, we shouldn't care about AI systems until we've fully achieved justice for animals. That's just a recipe for indefinitely putting off the issue. And I think that would be a mistake.
Right. Interesting. Well said, sir. Very, very interesting stuff. Lots to think about here. I want to thank you for being a guest today. It's been wonderful talking to you about all things AI conscious and moral. It's great to have you. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks so much. Great conversation. Appreciate you having me.
All right. Take care.